So WordNet has been useful in natural language processing. The first really big success in what's thought of as a more obscure task is in probabilistic parsing, specifically this idea of prepositional phrase attachments. Okay, I'll show you what I mean. Suppose I have the phrase, "We welcome the newcomers among us." Okay? So you can think of it as like welcoming first years to UBC or something like that. Okay? This phrase, "among us," which word is it referring to? Now, if you're not sure, because you're not sure what it is I'm asking, then that's one thing. But there's actually an ambiguity here, which is part of the problem. Okay? So when I'm saying among us, are we saying that the newcomers are among us and we are welcoming them? Or maybe the newcomers aren't among us, but we are welcoming them among us? So which do we mean? So that's what this idea of prepositional phrase attachment means. This prepositional phrase, do we attach it to this word or do we attach it to this word when we're doing our syntactic parsing? And using stuff in WordNet helped us do better at that task. Yay. And there's a paper reference if you're interested. Word sense disambiguation, obviously. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of WordNet, right? These are the different senses of a word. If you're interested in summarization, there's this thing called lexical chains, where you see a word over and over again. You go, hey, all of this stuff has to do with this word. Maybe there's one or two sentences that are more relevant than others along this chain. So some good stuff. And finally, we can use WordNet as a starting point for other ontologies. So maybe we want to build another ontology on top of WordNet that takes all of these things, but then adds additional relations between these ideas. Okay. So that's okay. All right. So if are you on a call or something?
Yeah.
Do you want to do the call outside? Okay, thanks. All right. So a couple of NLP ideas. If we're talking about relations among their words and their meanings, well, that's what we were already talking about with WordNet, right? Okay, so we've got a certain meaning that a bunch of words can have, and another meaning that a bunch of words can have, and these meanings can have relationships with it. And we call it paradigmatic. I'm not going to require you to remember that, don't worry. Okay. But what about the internal structure of particular words? So for example, if I have the word ate, I ate something. What verb is that a part of? To eat, right? How the heck would we know that? But what we can do is we can build up basically an ontology and knowledge base of these things. Okay. And represent, here, let me just, there we go. Okay. So we can come up with relationships between words and the events that we find them in, the participants that they're in, and these various concepts. So let's take this word ate for a minute. I ate a turkey sandwich for lunch. Okay, so that means there's a relationship between the word ate, between the word sandwich, between the word lunch. Okay? And so we can set it up like this. We can say that there exists a word, such that this word is an eating word. And the eater related to this word is the speaker of the sentence. And the thing that was eaten was a turkey sandwich, and that the meal that was eaten was lunch. Fair enough? Okay, so, and then this other one, there is a thing that there's a word that's a serving word, the server is Nam, and it is not the case that the thing being served was meat. Okay, so it's an idea of taking these different aspects of a particular word. And again, all of this stuff right now is not for memorization. Okay, this is just for, hey, this is cool stuff. NLP is cool. I should do NLP research. Okay, that's what this part is. And we're going to get into some really cool stuff. And just spoiler alert. I'm going to show you that to an extent it's possible to do math with words, like meanings of words, perform mathematical operations on them. Okay, you're going to like it. I promise. Well, you may not, but I almost promise. Okay, so now there's other things we need to consider about these words. They have semantic roles, right? Like the word hire. It doesn't just have a meaning, but it has a role in a piece of text, right? And so there's this other ontology called FrameNet. And so it's a database containing a number of what we call frames, where we have, you can think of a frame as being like a scenario of some kind. And then you get to see the roles that each word is playing out in this scenario. Okay? So yes, fine. Okay. So for example, we can have this entry, hiring. And so note the definition has specific roles in it. So there's an employer, an employee, compensation, hopefully, okay, a task, position, and a related field. All of these things are related to the idea of hiring, right? And specifically in a scenario in which hiring would be done. So notice it's not like WordNet in that we're not giving synonyms of the word hire. But what we're doing is it's like we're giving a context for the word hire. All right. So let's take this word hire and give a couple of examples. So some of the roles would be the employer, the employee, the task, and the position. So one example would be in 1979, singer Nancy Wilson hired him, whoever him is, to open her nightclub act. Okay, so now we have these things being labeled. Who is the employer? Nancy Wilson. Who's the employee? Him, whoever that is. Okay? What's the task? To open the nightclub act. Nothing about the specific position, but we've got another example where we have the position of cook within a particular organization in the restaurant. So that's the idea that FrameNet's going for. All right. So let's go even bigger. This idea of Yago 2. The semantic knowledge base, derived from WordNet, but also Wikipedia. And geonames. I'm assuming that's some kind of, I'm not sure what geonames is, but anyway, you can look it up if you want. Okay? So, over 10 million entities in that particular database, and associated with those entities are more than 120 million facts. So that's pretty sweet. Now, I don't know who manually evaluated this thing. They can't have exhaustively done it. They must have gone, here is an acceptable sample size, and we will manually evaluate this. One of the other cool things about Yago, though, is that everything else we've talked about so far has just been about meanings. But here, what Yago does is it also has relations, what they call anchors in this case, in terms of time and space. So if we take, for example, in 1979, the singer hired him to open the nightclub or something. I already forget what the sentence was. But in Yago, 1979, that's our time dimension. And the nightclub would probably have some spatial position. So yeah, we can go even bigger. Freebase no longer exists, but we'll talk about it anyway. It was replaced, but basically, it's this gigantic thing, tens of millions of topics, types, basically. You get a whole bunch of external sources, various databases, Wikipedia, all that stuff. And then Freebase, because people can contribute to it as well. Okay? And so, it was available for free, but then it got replaced by Google. They called it the knowledge graph instead. So different API. Freebase got shut down, but you've got the knowledge graph instead, which is basically freebase version 2. I guess you can think of it like that. Okay, and of course Google's doing it, therefore Microsoft has to do it as well. And so they have their own thing called Probase. They updated that as well. They call this what Google called theirs the knowledge graph. I think Microsoft renamed theirs the concept graph or something like that. Very imaginative. So the idea with Probase is they basically scoured the web, millions of web pages, search logs, and so yeah, over 2.7 million categories, and they've got a probabilistic model for correctness. So, based on everything, what is the probability that the thing you're looking for is this value? Okay. So here's an example of how Probase is structured. Okay, so taxonomy is not a word we encounter every day. Taxonomy is just another way of saying system of classification. So, for example, we can have the concept of markets, and there can be sub-concepts: European markets, North American markets, emerging markets, and presumably this is a slide from a while ago because I don't think we call China an emerging market anymore. It's pretty much emerged at this point. But yeah, so an instance of this emerging market would have been China, and so now that we've got this instance, well, now we can know some things about it. It'll have some attributes: population of China, the size of China, how GDP, imports, exports, all that stuff. And then we can have another thing: developing countries. So among the developing countries, there are some that are newly industrialized. I don't know enough about India to know if that's still valid or not, but whatever. And notice that there's a relationship between the emerging markets and the newly industrialized countries. And they have a similarity value here. So how much overlap is there between these concepts? How similar are they? So yeah, lots and lots of concepts. They've got some that are pretty, so yeah. Obviously the x-axis is the concepts themselves, and then this is a logarithmic scale of how many times you see particular instances inside the base. You've got some popular concepts: cities, musicians, lots of examples of those, but they also have things like celebrity wedding dress designers, which apparently is a thing. So, well, of course it's a thing. Anyway, so again, Microsoft is saying, let's call it the concept graph instead. So here's something that I do want to take a minute on, because Microsoft is saying that these are the dimensions in which we should be evaluating these ontologies. Okay, so it proposed 3 of them, and of course Probase did better in 2 out of the 3. Not a little bit biased there, but whatever. Yeah, it's still useful stuff. So first off, we've got depth. Okay, so how much information is there about a specific topic? Okay, so you want to talk about black holes, blackholes.com is going to be pretty deep on that stuff, right? Breadth, well, how many topics does it cover? Okay, it's covering black holes, sure, but is it also covering skin cancer or other kinds of stuff as well? And then finally, does it contain rich connections? So that's the density. Now, what do you suppose I mean by rich connections? So something along the lines of, if I've got 2 topics, maybe there's a lot of different kind of connections between them, or if I've got a network of topics, you could think of them as being very densely connected. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So they give us a few examples here, like IMDb. Obviously, it's just about movies. We're not going to see anything about custom electronics or artificial intelligence unless it happens to be the focus of a movie, right? So they're pretty deep, and to an extent, they've got some fairly rich connections. You've got a person who could be an actor in this movie and a director in this movie and a producer in this one, and here's all the movies they've been in and all that stuff. So the connections aren't too bad. but yeah, depth not so much. And then we've got the competitors of Probase, which is Google's thing, and they go, yeah, they know some stuff. But we know a lot more. We've got more connections, and we've got more breadth. So yeah, but it's still useful to think about these three different categories as being able to cover the overall richness of the database levels. Awesome. So what if we want to go specific? So we can have a specific thing like a medical ontology. Yes?
Where's the connection? Do you value connections, let's say, like neighbors of like some things, like if some subject is really closely related to another subject, or do you also care about like some subject is related to another subject itself? Like let's say, like, I don't know, the color of some clothing is related to fashion, and then fashion is related to economy. Do you care about how closely they're related, or the fact that they're related when you say connect?
Right, when we're talking, okay, so when we're talking about connections, the answer for that in terms of what Microsoft thinks, I couldn't say for sure. I haven't used Probase myself for my own research. It's feasible to assume that when they're talking about rich connections, if they talk about, some celebrity's car is red, well, there are other things that are red as well and have that connection through there. Whether or not they care about the closeness of the connections or just the fact that there are lots of connections so that you can get from, what did they call it? The 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon or something like that? If you can do that kind of thing, I couldn't say, but I imagine they've got all kinds of stuff to tell you about that on Probases or concept graph now. Cool. So yeah, do you think WordNet has very much on a variety of lung diseases? Probably not necessarily. Or various genetic processes? Not necessarily so much. So having a large general ontology is very useful, but if your task doesn't need all that extra information, sometimes it can be more useful to just have a very targeted ontology. And an example of this is this unified medical language system. Okay, so you've got health and biomedical terms that are linked together, allowing you to, it provides a mechanism whereby people can develop health records online with various classification tools. So here's a piece of it, just a little piece. And so they've got a whole bunch of different kind of relationships. They've got here that the ones without arrows are just ISA relations, and the ones with arrows are various kinds of non-ISA relations. So, for example, a human is a mammal, is a vertebrate, is an animal, is a eukaryote, is an organism. That's fine. But note this biologic function, it has a non-ISA link to organism, and that non-ISA link is specified as a process of. So this is a process of type relationship, saying that a biologic function is a process of an organism, which makes sense because a biologic function would not be a process of a building. So again, it's just a way of taking all of these concepts and being able to relate them in a number of ways that we can then query. All right. Now we get to it might be my favorite part of the course. We'll see. I think it is. It's really cool stuff. Okay. So we're going to talk about word similarity and different ways of being able to calculate word similarity. So there's a bunch of different metrics that we can use. Some of them involve ontologies. Some of them, which are some of the more advanced words nowadays, don't require ontologies. And so yeah, we're going to be able to just describe and justify these metrics. All right. So, well, first off the question, why do we care about word similarity? Why would it matter? So what happens if we have no concept of word similarity? No concept whatsoever.
You have one word for everything?
Yeah, you have one word for everything, or if you have two words that mean the same thing, then you're screwed, because every time you're trying to look for a particular word and you see the other word, oh, that's a different word. So let's take this example. So we've got the word fast is similar to rapid, the word tall is similar to the word height. So for question answering, if I ask, how tall is Mount Everest? And I don't have a specific piece of information saying Mount Everest is 29,029 feet tall, but I instead have a statement saying the height of Mount Everest is 29,029 feet, then knowing, hey, tall and height are similar words, it's probably the answer to the question. So word similarity is a very useful thing. Any questions on this? Okay. So we can extend this to sentence or even paragraph similarity, right? If we've got lots of similar words in two sentences, then the two sentences are probably fairly similar to each other. If we've got lots of similar words in two documents, then the documents are probably similar to each other. That's actually a way that we can do topic modeling through, what was it called? Latent semantic, no. Oh, I forget what it's called. Anyway, basically you've got a whole bunch of words and you go, hey, these words show up a lot in this document and this document, but not in this document. They must be a lot different ones. Similar. All right. And summarization. Again, identifying redundancy is a big deal in summarization, because if you have, for example, a document, or let's say a book, Of Mice and Men. How many of you have read Of Mice and Men? Not a very long book. Okay. So suppose that we have, we've got some very important sentences, right? So if somebody were to write something about Of Mice and Men, and they were to say that, George shot Lenin. Yeah, George shot Lenin.
Spoilers.
Yeah, spoiler alert. It's not a very long book. It's worth the read anyway. Or George kills Lenin. Okay? They're very similar sentences, right? If I'm writing a summary of this person's spoiler-filled document, do I actually need to include both those sentences? Because if you shoot them, you probably kill them, right? It's redundant information. Or you can be really clever and went, George shot and killed Lenin. And then you're really coming up with some complicated summaries here. Okay. So just a reminder from last time, we have these sin sets, right? So the word table, according to WordNet, has 6 different meanings, and each one of those meanings is associated with a sin set. Okay, so we've got 6 different sin sets, and each sin set has a gloss. So, the gloss for this second one here, a piece of furniture having a smooth flat top, usually supported by one or more vertical legs, etc. And then the verb table has only one sense. Okay. And then in WordNet we have all these different relations, hypernym, hyponym. So has member, so a department has students, a department has professors. Okay. So all of these different kinds of relationships. So if we've got all of these meanings, and each meaning has a gloss or a definition, and all of these meanings have relationships between them, okay? Where are we getting this? Okay, so actually I'm going to do this first, and then I'll come back to the bit I just missed. So if I've got access to WordNet, then which aspects of WordNet would I be using to estimate the similarity of words? prefective set, which is just a set of words having the same meaning. The gloss is just a description of that meaning, so you can go look at it. I don't know why they call it gloss. Probably related to the word gloss. All right, so let's stop in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So yeah, presumably, if the words are similar to each other, you don't need all 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, right? Because it'd be pretty close together in the graph, so we could use that. We could also use the information in the glosses themselves. So let's pop back for a second. And just a simple example of the idea of semantic similarities and distances. So a table, thinking of it in terms of furniture, like that table over there, is not like a hill. And a hill is not like a lamp. And a lamp is not like this other meaning of table, meaning a flat bit of land. But the hill is very similar to a mesa. Okay, mesa you can think of as just a chopped off hill, right? And a table and a lamp are similar, not because they're similar things, but because you put one on top of the other. All right. So let's start with talking about this idea of gloss overlaps. So somebody named Les had this idea, well, if related words, okay, if 2 words are related, then their associated glosses should have some kind of word overlap between them, okay? Because generally we're going to use the same words to describe similar things, okay? So if we've got the 2 meanings of bank, for example, so financial institution, well, that's nothing like a lake. But the bank sloping land beside a body of water, well, that is much more related. I mean, it's not the same thing as a lake, but it's much more related to the word lake. And notice we're sharing some words. Okay. So Les's idea was, hey, let's take these word overlaps and we'll use them to calculate similarity. So yeah, we can just say that our gloss overlap is just the number of content words common to both glosses, and we can define this as relatedness. Okay? So yeah, the relatedness of the land version of bank with lake is 3, but the financial institution is 0 related to the body of water. Okay? But there's a problem. A lot of these glosses are short. So even relatively similar words aren't necessarily guaranteed to have overlap, right? So for example, consider the word run and consider the word fly. Verbs in both cases, run, fly. Well, I haven't looked up their glosses, but I expect that there might be 1 or 2 words in common, but there's not going to be a whole lot of overlap there, even though the words themselves are fairly similar, right? They're both ways of moving. So what can we do? Any thoughts on what we can do to hack our way around this problem? Yeah.
Can you have look at the list of examples of using fly and using run and see if there's overlap in the examples?
Okay.
Say like move there, right, ran there, say could be some.
Okay. So examples of using run and examples of using the 2 words and seeing how much overlap there is. So that's not what we do here, but that's very similar to a very cool idea we come across later called the distributional hypothesis. So we will get to that. Yes?
What if, to get more words, if you replace one word in the current gloss with its gloss, and then we do that with like a lot of the words, and we end up with a really long gloss?
Okay, run that by me.
So, you take a word from the current gloss, and you replace that word with its gloss in the original gloss. So now you have more words for wood.
Okay, so that's one way of extending it. So if we've got, so for example, lake, take, instead of water, well, maybe not replace water, but add to the gloss the entire gloss related to water. Okay, I like it. It does have issues when I get to the word beside.
Oh, maybe not like every word, but
Right, and then we have the problem of, well, how do we tell which words are actually important?
now.
So nouns definitely, but what if we're asking about the similarities between two verbs? So I like your idea. I'm just saying this is not a trivial thing. So yeah, this is good stuff. Now, less extended idea was quite similar. Okay. So they have this idea of, well, let's say that I've got. I'm trying to compare. Give me two words. They don't have. Well, give me one word.
Hairpin.
Hairpin. All right. Okay, and another word. Doesn't have to be related.
Batman.
Batman. All right. Okay. Yeah, who knows what he does under that coat, right? Okay. So the idea is, Batman's gloss is going to be fairly short. It's just, right? And then the hairpin will be related to some other stuff, right? Okay. So let's build a gloss here, or not build a gloss, but we build a sin set. Okay. So hairpin. I don't know what a synonym for hairpin is. I'm sorry, I've never used one. I'll just say elastic, whatever. Barrettes, maybe something like that. Okay. So now we have all these relations in WordNet. Okay. We have antonyms. Okay. So let's take the antonyms. And antonyms. Okay. I don't know what the antonym of a hairpin is going to be, but you know the antonym of Batman is probably Joker, right? So put Joker in there. Okay. So there's going to be some other sin set that's an antonym of each of these things, and then we go to the next relation, and we go, well, is this a subset of anything? Yeah. So we're going to have superhero on this side, hair care products on this side. Okay. And so for each of these relations, we go out and we get more sin sets. Then we take all their glosses. And now we've got a lot more glosses to work with, and we do the overlap again. Okay? So that way, we don't have to worry quite so much about which specific words we're using, although probably we would just get rid of words like and things that we call stop words. So, here's an example. So sentence. The penalty meted out to one judged guilty. On the bench, the person who hears cases in a court of law. So like a judge, right? Okay, so a sentence would be a subset of a final judgment. And now we've got a couple of overlap words. So we are able to find a similarity. Sound good? Awesome. So we got a couple of questions. First, how do we measure these overlaps? Because one word may have a whole bunch of things connected to it. You've got a whole bunch of different glosses to use. And so maybe you have a number of overlapped words, but that number of overlapped words is just a really small fraction of the total words available. So just using the straight up number of words isn't necessarily the best. And which relations do we want to use for this gloss extension? Okay, so first off, well, starting out, just summing up the overlapped words, not necessarily the best way to approach it, but this is better. Okay, what if we've got phrases? If we've got whole phrases overlapping? Well, a phrase should be weighted more heavily than just a single word, right? So we go, all right, since these phrasal matches are rarer, more informative, so we've got the phrase court of law. Okay. So we want that phrase court of law to be worth more than just 3 individual words. Okay? So what we do is we score it by the square of the length. Okay? So the phrase court of law is worth 9, whereas the word just law by itself would get just a score of 1. Sound good?
Why are we doing that?
Sorry, say again?
Why are we scoring 9 or lower than price?
So, suppose you see the word court in two glosses, okay, 2 different glosses. Okay, one gloss is for judgment, and the other is for tense. So is the word court that useful? I mean, it can be, but it's not guaranteed to be. But how likely am I to find the phrase court of law at Wimbledon? Probably not so much. Okay? Although even that's been, I don't know, yeah, anyway, we're not going to worry about people freaking out in tennis courts. So, the idea here is that if we have a whole phrase, and it's the same phrase in both, that's way bigger of an indicator to us than just an individual word. And so yeah, we just decided let's square it. I mean, we could have done e to the n, we could have done some other thing like that, but just some function that's greater than linear to weight the phrases heavier. Okay. So in this case, we revisit our original comparison of the word bank and the word lake rather. Okay, so we've got a phrase, body of water, so that's a score of 9, and then land gets a score of 1, so our overlap score is at 10. Okay. So which relations do we want to use? Well, the hypernyms are good. Okay, so if we're talking about cars, it's also good to include the glosses for vehicles, because a car is a vehicle. Okay, hyponyms, so subclasses, pickup truck, convertible, Maserati, whatever kind of cars you're talking about. Okay. Now, Meriden, I'm not gonna force you to memorize all of these terms. Don't worry about it. So a car has an accelerator. Okay, so Meriden is just a part of the relationship. And we can do more if we want. Okay, so our approach, we take our 2 sin sets, we find our phrasal gloss overlaps between those sin sets. Okay, for each relation, we compute the gloss overlaps between the connected sin sets. And notice we do that on a per relation basis. And then we add them all up to get a relatedness score overall. So is that a perfect score? No, we're gonna find out that there's always more than one way to do a thing. But are there any questions about this last process? The regular or the extended? Yeah.
Oh, so just to clarify, is each relation referring to each phrasal overlap?
Okay, so for each relation, that's actually referring to the relations that are built into the word net itself. So like the hypernyms, the antonym. So it's the relations that are relating a particular sin set to other sin sets. Yeah. Yes?
So for the scoring part, is it like giving score to the exactly matching phrases in the 2 sentences, or?
Yeah, exactly matching phrases and exactly matching words. So if you're doing this thing where you're including the weight of the phrase as being more important than the weight of individual words, then you take that phrase and you do n squared with its length, and that's its contribution to the overall overlap, and then any words by themselves, they just get added individually. Yeah. Yes?
So when we say we're checking for overlaps, it'll see A, check its hypernyms, and B's hypernyms, and check the overlap in between their
Yeah. Yeah, so if we're talking about, for example, A's hypernyms and B's hypernyms, then yes, we're doing the comparison across those glosses because it may have some use, for example, to compare A's hypernyms and B's antonyms, but not necessarily, so let's do it on a per relation basis. Yeah, I don't know if anybody's tried to just cram the whole thing together or not, but might be interesting, I suppose. Okay, and the cool, yes?
Are we scoring it differently if it's the word's gloss itself, like A's gloss and B's gloss versus the hypernyms have a relation?
Now, okay, so that's an interesting question. So are we weighting the glosses themselves the same as we do the extended bits?
Yeah.
To my knowledge, we are weighting them the same in the version of the West measure, the extended West measure, but there's no reason that you couldn't try and figure out if there's some optimal weighting such that, hey, if we've got this, directly, it's worth more than this relation, and let's include this relation, but it's not worth that much, and so on. So it wouldn't surprise me if that's been done, but I haven't looked into that myself. Okay, cool. The other nice thing is that A and B don't have to be the same part of speech. We can have the verb run and the noun fly. And it doesn't really matter because we're just looking for word overlaps in their glosses, right? There's nothing requiring that they have to be the same part of speech. Cool. Any other questions about this stuff? Yeah, you're all wondering when we're getting to the math. Don't worry, we'll get there soon. Okay, so this, it's just a diagram of the idea. Okay, so let's get into some ideas of path length. So we can go, hey, if we've got two concepts, say nickel and Richter scale, how similar are those? Well, if we have some kind of hierarchy or some kind of graph linking them all together, we can just go, well, how far away are they from each other on the graph? And 1 over that length is a similarity. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's actually, oh, maybe I should have kept the hairpin. Oh, I'll write it back. So for example, hairpin could be connected to hair, could be connected to head, could be connected to hat, could be connected to cowl, could be connected to back. Okay? So we have to take quite a few steps to get from one to the other. So the path length between them is fairly long. Therefore, since that's long, so 1 over a long number is quite small. So we conclude that hairpin and backhand are not very similar words. Does that make things a bit more clear? Okay. So, what's the problem with that? There's always a problem. So, what's the problem with this? Yeah.
There's gotta be some like subsets of a bigger thing that even though they're close, they're not really that similar.
Okay. So you're saying subsets or common neighbors that aren't? That may be the case. I'm not going to rule out that possibility. We are just doing an approximation though, and so I wouldn't say that that's. I mean, that is a concern, but it's not necessarily the biggest concern. Yes.
So like nickel might be more similar to coin than budget is to fund, even though they both have like one line.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what we're kind of assuming that path length, that each arc means the same, implies the same distance. Okay. So nickels and dimes are very similar things, right? Only 2 path length between them. Well, let's find something else that's only 2 path length between them. How about, let's see.
Scale and medium.
Yeah, scale and medium of exchange. Are those things very similar to each other? Not really. And generally, the information gap tends to get bigger and bigger the higher up you go. So treating them all the same isn't necessarily a great approach. But we can build on this. So what we can do is we can think of something called the information content of the thing. Okay? So first I'm going to describe what this slide is saying, and then I'm going to talk about information content. Okay? So for this slide, let's say that we've acquired this database of 2 to the 30 things. Okay? So that's how many we've got. And everything's going to be 2 to the something because we're going to deal with logs. And it's just easier to start out with powers if you're going to be doing logs. Don't forget about the 2 to the whatever stuff. So we've got 2 to the 30 things. And we say that of those 2 to the 30 things, perhaps 2 to the 17 of them are animals. Okay? And of those 2 to the 17 animals, perhaps only 2 to the 11 of them are mammals, and 2 to the 10 of them are reptiles. And out of our mammals, we've got 2 to the 7 cats and 2 to the 8 dogs. Okay, so this is what so the total number of things is still 2 to the 30. Because every cat is still a mammal, every mammal is still an animal, and every mammal is still, or every animal is still a thing. Okay? So, the idea of information content is related to, well, how far down this tree are you? So if I say that I'm talking about a thing, how much information have I just given you? None whatsoever. I've narrowed it down to basically everything, right? Yeah, pun intended, right? So, okay, now if I say I'm talking about a mammal, okay, I've actually narrowed it down somewhat. There's some actual information there, but it's still pretty vague. Okay? Now, if I'm talking about a cat, then we are starting to get specific. There's still a lot of cats, though. So, but then if I eventually talk about my cat that I used to have when I lived on Vancouver Island, and she was a gorgeous little cat, and I miss her very much. But if I talk about this cat, now I've given you a lot of information, right? Because it can't be any other thing other than my cat. So that's the idea of information content. So how do we get this information content? First, we get the probability of the thing that we're talking about. Okay? So that's just the count of the thing divided by the total number of things. So if I'm talking about the probability of cat, well, my count is just this thing in yellow here. So there's 2 to the 7 cats. And n is just the count of all things, which is this 2 to the 30. Right? So my probability of a thing being a cat is 2 to the 7 divided by 2 to the 30. We good? Cool. So now that's going to be a negative, or it's going to be a number much, much smaller than 1. Yeah? So to get the information content, first we take the log of that probability. Okay, so it's easier when we write it down. So if we're talking about cats, we've got 2 to the 7 divided by 2 to the 30, right? Okay, and that's just the same as 2 to the negative 23, right? Now if we take the log base 2 of this, so log of 2 to the minus 23, that's just equal to minus 23 times the log of 2, which I'm saying is 1. And so now we've got minus 23. But information content should, like, we don't think of it as a negative thing, right? So we take the negative of the log, so that the smaller the number of examples we have, the more negative this is, so the bigger its negative is, and so we have more information content. Okay, are there any questions on that? Yeah.
Where does the n come from? Like, give an example, or if we look at the dictionary, then that's our n is then we've been all these include.
So n is going to be the number of all things. And so in this tree, it's going to be 2 to the 30.
Like, this is some database, and you group them, like this would, for every example we have.
Yeah, so this example could just be a list of things that we're talking about in some gigantic set of documents. Okay, so it could be the number of entities in an ontology, for example. Yeah.
If you use the thing divided by like the thing, so like you count thing divided by thing, so like 2 to the power 30 divided by 2 to the power 30 by 1, then you still using the minus log 1.
Okay, so what happens if we want to calculate the information content of a thing? Okay, well, so our thing, well, what's the probability of thing? The probability of thing is 2 to the 30 divided by 2 to the 30, which is equal to 1. Okay, so what is the log of 1? 0. Okay, so the information content of thing is 0, which works for us. Okay, that
Negative
fits
0.
what we want to, that fits what we want to think of as information content. All right. So, well, we've got this idea of information content. But, well, how do we apply this to similarities or distances between words? Well, so somebody named Resnick came up with the idea of, hey, let's do a similarity between two things, C1 and C2, as being just the information content of their lowest common ancestor. Okay? So they call it here lowest common subsumer. Okay, so if we're going back here, if we're talking about the similarity between cat and snake, well, what's the lowest common subsumer or lowest common ancestor of both cat and snake?
Animal.
Animal. And so we can claim that the similarity between cat and snake is just the information content of animal. Okay? And that's all this is saying here. So they got this big long thing here. So the probability of the lowest common subsumer of C1 and C2, okay? And we've got what the probability is minus log P, it's just the information content. Okay? So this Resnick similarity is just the information content of the lowest common ancestor of both the things we care about. Now, does that sound like a particularly useful approach? I mean, it's not horrible. It's better than just the number of paths, or the path length. So we're looking at two similarities here. One between dog and snake, and one between mammal and reptile. Will they give us the same value? Okay, so let's stop in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I agree. They are going to be the same because they've got the same lowest common ancestor, right? And so they're both animals. And so it's going to be the same thing because their lowest common subsumer is the same. All right. Is it reasonable for us to conclude that a dog and a snake are just as similar to each other as a mammal and a reptile?
In what context?
Yeah, it's gonna have like a 3 string. Okay, so we stop in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I agree. So keep in mind that these are, if we're talking about reptile and mammal, that these are categories, right? So let's, for example, take dog and snake. Are they just as similar to each other as, say, a dog and a lizard? I mean, the lizard's got legs and the snake doesn't, right? So you could say that the dog is more similar to a lizard than it is to a snake. So we can't necessarily say that any example of two classes is going to be just as similar to each other as each class is to each other. Does that make sense? So, don't worry, we're going to get through this. How much more time do we have? Because I want to get to the really good stuff. I mean, this stuff's pretty good. Don't get me wrong, this stuff's pretty good, but we're going to get to the really good stuff in a minute. Okay. So, these people, Jack Conrath, went, okay, let's instead worry about how different they are. Okay, how much information they don't share. So, if we're talking about two things and all of the information inherent in the thing. So we've got, say, a dog, right? Fur, usually, eyes, ears, legs, tail, usually, you know, all that stuff. And then we take this idea of snake, okay? No legs, but eyes, teeth, nervous system, you know, that kind of stuff. And let's go, well, let's think about how much information they have different instead of how much information is in common. And so they come up with this lovely formula using information content minus, okay, where is it? Yeah. So the formula that they're going for is how much information is in the shaded areas. Okay? How much information do they not share? So basically, it's the idea of we take all the information of dog and subtract the shared information. And we take all the information of snake and subtract the shared information. And so we end up with the information content of the first thing, add the information content of the second thing, minus twice the shared information content. Where the shared information content can be thought of as the information content of their lowest common ancestor. You okay with it? All right. And that's just more of the same. Once we have this distance, we can just go 1 over for the similarity. That's all that is. All right. Unfortunately, we run across a problem that, well, dog and snake are both nouns. Okay, we're working with some kind of a hierarchy of things. And generally, hierarchies of things don't have samples from different parts of speech. So I'm not going to find the verb to climb in this hierarchy because to climb isn't an animal. It's not a thing, it's an action. Okay? So yeah, there's going to be some issues there. More of that. Oh yeah, and feel free to look at this on your own. I really want to get to the good stuff. Basically, this is just showing, this is our Resnick stuff that we said was the same before, and we noticed that if we use the Jing-Conrath distance, we get different distances for our two different samples, which is nice. Yes. Okay, good. We got some good stuff. Okay, so what happens if you don't have any dictionaries or any thesauri? I don't know why you put Russian there, because there's resources for Russian, but Russian is an amazing language, by the way. It's like the Unix of languages. I love it. It really is. Simple, powerful, like, holy crap, it's way better than English in a lot of ways. Anyway, No, it totally is. Anyway, so if you don't have any of these things, or even if you do have some of these resources, they aren't necessarily going to give you all the information you want in order to be able to make this claim. So what we do is somebody came up with kind of a brilliant insight, and it's such a simple one. Okay? Two words are similar if they share similar contexts. Okay? Let me give you a simple example of a context. Okay? I hug my something in the morning. Okay? Don't go there. Okay? So, if I put the word wife in here. Okay? Makes sense, yes? Okay? How about my son? Are these similar words? Yeah, they're pretty similar words. Daughter? Okay? How about my cat? Not everybody hugs their cat. How about cactus? Okay? My cat, a cactus is not like my wife, not in any sense of the word. Okay? This is a context. And so we say similar words will have similar contexts. So what can we do with this? We can take this and we can basically get semantic meaning out of vast chunks of text without having to really pay much attention to what that text is. All right, so here's another example. So we got a bottle of Tesguino. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's on the table. Tesguino makes you drunk. We make Tesguino out of corn. What is it? Some kind of alcoholic beverage, yeah? How did you know? Because context. Okay? So we had the word drunk nearby. We had the word bottle nearby. So we're able to take that context. Okay? An alcoholic beverage may or may not be like beer. So yeah, we say two words are similar if they have similar word context. And so we can build a word-word matrix. Okay, so we take this massive chunk of text, and for every word in that chunk of text, when we're in some word, we look how many words, we have some window. X words this way, X words that way. It can be 5 words in either direction, 10 words in either direction, whatever you want. And go, okay, what words are in my context? And then every time you find a word, you increment it. Okay. So, for example, the word apricot. Okay, so there's plus or minus 7 words in each direction. And so we've got our word matrix here. How many times do we see aardvark in there? None. We don't see computer or data. Pinch, that works. Okay, so pinch has something to do with it. Sugar has something to do with it. And we just, every time we see the word apricot, we do this, and we increment them until we basically have this big old matrix of how many times do we see word X and word Y within a certain number of words of each other. Yes?
Where did the words come from? How do we choose the words?
We don't. It's the same words. Okay, so so that might be a bit more confusing. Let me do it like this. Okay, so we've got our apricot, we've got our pineapple, we've got our digital, and so on and so forth. Okay, across the top here, we're going to see the same thing. Apricot, pineapple. Okay? So it's an n by n word matrix. Every word to every word. We're just seeing the blue ones a bit differently because apricot doesn't appear beside itself very much. Okay? And so try to make the example a bit more readable, but instead we made it more confusing. So yes. Okay. So yeah, it's going to be an n by n. Okay, all of our words to all of our words, and so we can build up this this matrix. Now, if we think about the columns as representing pieces of context, then the row is a vector representing the word. So we've actually turned a word into a vector of numbers, which is kind of cool. And we can do cool things with these vectors of numbers. Okay. Okay. So this is a simple example of what we call word embeddings. Okay. So we're embedding the words into a vector space. Okay. Now, are there any questions about this? Yeah.
Are you going to normalize the vector or something? Because you see the same word many times, you're going to have like type after.
Okay, are we going to normalize the vectors? We can. I don't think we necessarily have to. Yeah, I don't think we necessarily have to, but I think in my practice, whenever I did it, I always normalized the vectors. But I think there might be some cases where you wouldn't want to normalize them. Yeah.
Sorry, you were saying the rows are vectors, and sorry, the columns again were.
The context. Yeah. So basically, if you're talking about a specific kind of context for the word cat, okay? So what words are you likely to see with the word cat? Dog, fish, birds, sleep, scratch, right? And so together, those columns of your table kind of make up that particular context. So every context you can think of is actually a combination of columns in this matrix. And so yeah, you've got in terms of that matrix, each row is a vector for the word. Was there, yes?
How do we determine like a threshold for the radius of neighborhood when we're measuring each row?
Okay, so how do we decide how big to make the window? That's going to be up to you. So, I mean, it's, to my knowledge, it's a try it and see how it works. Generally, let's see, I think I did something similar to this in my thesis, and I think I used 10. I mean, there's going to be the trade-off, right? So if you choose something small, your matrix is going to be kind of sparse, right? Your matrix is going to be kind of sparse, but everything is going to be very directly related to the word you're talking about, yeah? Because the bigger you make your window, the more likely it is that you're straying out of your context and into another one. So, I mean, if you want, you could do something like average sentence length. And then maybe half your average sentence like this, how big you go on either side. That could be one way of going about it. If you're trying to come up with it programmatically instead of just saying, hey, I'm going to pick this number. Yeah. Okay, do we ever take punctuation into consideration? There's no reason why we couldn't. So we could just say that our window is the minimum of some number and the distance to a sentence boundary, perhaps. But then you'd have to go, well, that's periods. What about semicolons? What about commas? So, I mean, feel free to mess around with that however you like. And just keep in mind that it's very easy to fall deep down the rabbit hole. Okay, so far we're just dealing with counts. You know, these numbers are just counts of how often we're seeing them together. What's slightly more informative is this idea of what's called point-wise mutual information. Okay, so that's the top thing here. Okay, so the top thing here, point-wise mutual relation, is just how likely are we to find these words together versus how likely are we to find these words at all. Okay, so out of how many times we see them, how many times do we see them together? Is another way. Okay, so that's just a little math thing, just a bit of plug and chug. Okay. So quite frequently, it can be more useful to us to have the point-wise mutual information in those entries in our matrix, rather than just the counts of how many times we see them together. Now, the problem is that it can sometimes go negative And what does negative mean in terms of similarity? We're not really good at figuring dissimilarity out in the same way as we are similarity. So one thing we can do is we can just go positive pointwise mutual information. And so we just say if the value is negative, so we're actually seeing them together less frequently than if they were just independent of each other, then we'll just call that a 0 and move on. So we zero out the negative values and just keep the positive ones. And yeah, we're going to want really big corporate for this. All right. So yeah, that's just what I was saying there. So positive pointwise mutual information. Okay. How much time do we have? Okay, so we're really close. We're really close. This is just an example of if two words are completely independent of each other, then the probability that we'll see them together is just the probability of the one word times the probability of the other word, right? And so in the end, we get different values depending on whether they're completely dependent on each other, like we always see them together, or completely independent of each other, like we only ever see them together by pure chance. So now we have these vectors. Well, what can we do with them? Well, these are going to be massive things, right? So it would be nice if we can make the vectors a little smaller. And so what we can do is there's this thing called singular value decomposition. Basically, we have some matrix here. I'm going to call it M. This is my matrix. And it's going to be the case that we can have it as the product of 3 other matrices. Okay? So what we do is if we go, I do my singular value decomposition, and let's just ignore these. I want this matrix right here. So now, if I've got 1,000,000 words, well, I still have vectors for 1,000,000 words. But now maybe each vector, instead of having 1,000,000 elements, maybe only has 500. Okay? And we find that they do still work fairly well at capturing this semantic information. If we want to be even cooler, there's neural network methods called using what are called skipgrams or CBA, which is continuous bag of words. The most famous example of this is a thing called word2vec. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, word2vec. Word2vec. Okay? So great, we're making these vectors. So what? Well, here's the so what. Similarity, we know how to do the similarity of vectors. Cosine similarity is one example. We've also got the Jaccard similarity, cosine similarity. Great. Similarity between vectors. So we've turned these words into vectors. How can we be sure that we've actually got any useful information here? Well, if we can vectorize these texts, it would sure be nice if we could do arithmetic operations on them, like similarity. So, the people who came up with word2vec, they did some little experiments, and they found a funny thing. And then I'll give you a couple of examples of the funny thing. So here's the first funny thing they did. They took the vector for king, okay, subtracted the vector for man, and added the vector for woman. And then they went, okay, what word has the most similar vector to the result? Yeah. So they actually got the vector for queen out of this. Okay, not necessarily exactly the vector for queen, but queen was the most similar word. Okay? Same idea, I think they went Paris minus France plus Poland, and they got Warsaw out of it. Okay? So we actually are being able to capture semantic meaning numerically, at least to a very useful extent. And so this idea of embedding, whether it's from neural models like word2vec or through what we call recursive neural networks, or recurrent neural networks rather, these things form the basis of most of our deep learning and natural language processing now. So this idea of word methods is really important. All right, so we got to the really good part. I hope it was worth it. Okay, so for next week, we will be starting into parsing text, so using context-free grammars. And don't forget, those of you who are done with anything related to regrades may pick up your exams now. And have a good weekend.